Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this next episode of our Towards Life 3.0 series. My name is Mathias Risse, and I am the director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy here at the Harvard Kennedy School. And I welcome all of you also on behalf of our executive director, Sushma Raman, who will be joining us for the Q&A period after the talk. Now, as many of you know, our series Towards Life 3.0 Ethics and Technology in the 21st Century has been going on for a few years. The title we are taking from Max Tegmark's wonderful book, Life 3.0, Being Human in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. And the goal of the series continues to be to explore the ethical and human rights related issues that arise in the course of the technological innovation that is happening all around us, and that eventually might take us to a full-fledged Life 3.0, a phase of life populated by entities that get to design both their culture, their software, so to speak, and their bodies, their hardware. We do not know if that kind of life will ever emerge or when, but we also don't want to start thinking about its ethical dimensions only once it is clear that it is indeed upon us. And in any event, there are plenty of such ethical and human rights related challenges all around us already that occur as part of this technological innovation. And that really already takes me to the speaker of the day and the topic of the day. We are very fortunate to have with us today Tina Kempen-Reuter, who is the director of the Institute for Human Rights and an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Alabama in Birmingham. And she specializes, Professor Kempen-Reuter specializes in human rights and peace studies and international politics. And among other topics, more specifically in that domain, is a focus on human rights with a particular emphasis on the struggle of vulnerable populations. She studies how to use technology to improve access, inclusion, and participation of marginalized communities in society. And I'm also happy to say that she was a member of the inaugural cohort of Human Rights and Technology Fellows here at the Carr Center a few years ago. And the topic today that Professor Kempen-Reuter will talk to us about is human rights and the smart city. This has also long been one of her major research areas. So obviously many of us live in cities, and many of you will know that there has been a smart city movement all around the world. And the point there is that technology is used in order to more effectively channel the flow of people around the city, or to make it easier, to make it more efficient to deliver services to people who live in the city. So there has been a lot of activity in places like Singapore, also Barcelona and Zurich, among many other places. But this kind of technological innovation, the use of smart technology in cities also leads to a set of human rights issues all their own. And so in this talk then, in response to those challenges, Tina will develop a framework for how human rights relate to the city as this important dwelling place for human beings. And then she will continue to show how this framework is impacted by smart city technology, and will explore the kind of human rights implications that all of that has. And so we're very much looking forward to this discussion. So Tina will now speak for about 25 minutes or so, and after that, Sushma and I will pop up for our Q&A. And you in the audience, as questions come to your minds, please, you should feel perfectly free to put them in the YouTube chat. We will be screening that, and we will be integrating your questions into the Q&A that we will be having with Professor Kempen-Reuter after her talk. But now, without further ado, Tina, the screen is yours.
All right, thank you so much for the kind introduction. Thank you also for the invitation. I'm really excited to be able to talk to you today about human rights and the city. Let me, in the smart city, let me actually share my screen. I hope you can all see that for my talk. I want to start by talking briefly about cities today, sort of give a little bit of context for my research. So if we look at cities today, obviously, I'm sure you're all aware of this, cities are the habitat of humans today. We've seen city growth in all areas of the world, traditionally, obviously in the global north. Our cities have been growing. Urbanization is a big part, but we see the same happening in the global south. So projections are that about 65% of people will be living in cities by the time we hit 2050. With that, cities have become more important in terms of political, economic, social, and innovative power. You can see this again around the world. You can see this in our own country as well, where cities really play a role in policy generation. Our powerhouses of our economy and so on. Along with that was sort of the question, well, how do we administer? How do we deal with this growing space? And with that, we saw a growth in digitalization. So technology today is front and center in city administration and in governance. So you can see here a graph that shows the increase in the global smart city market. And again, this is a trend in the global north, but also increasingly in the global south. Now, if we look at all this from a human rights perspective, we see that cities really have become important hubs for activity, human rights activity. If you think about, sanctuary cities, for example, like the discussion around migration in the US, if you think about changes in the way in which policing is happening, often, these kinds of approaches happen in cities. So really, cities have become hubs for human rights activity, even though traditionally the actors in human rights are, states, right? If we think about it, human rights from a traditional point of view. So what we see today is really this localization of human rights in cities. So human rights are called to guide the local and local informed participatory and balance-seeking process. So local, while threats are often global, like think climate change, for example, they need to be addressed at the local level. Informed, the understanding of local circumstances, to confront some of these issues is particularly important. Participatory, meaning inclusion of the local population and the community in decision-making processes, multi-stakeholder processes, and so on. And again, sort of this balance seeking between different kinds of areas of focus, like economic versus social, environmental, political, and so on. So cities really are today at the front and center of human rights development, I would say. Interestingly enough, in the literature, this is a relatively new phenomenon. Like, it's not as well studied, and there's sort of two narratives that we can distinguish. One is this idea of the rights in the city, or the human rights city movement. This basically came out of Europe for the most part. It's basically cities that incorporate the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other types of documents at the city level. It's become pretty important. Like, there's the World Human Rights City Forum and so on, and mayors that meet on a regular basis to talk about this. It originally stemmed from the People's Movement for Human Rights Learning, and really kind of created a frame for again, human rights in the city. The other is the the right to the city movement, which basically calls for all inhabitants of the city to fully enjoy and contribute to city life. This movement stems more from the global south. It was especially strong in Latin America and focused particularly on urban justice. Let me just briefly talk a little bit more about this. Again, the right to the city, I would say, was sort of the first that developed it has been debated since the 1960s, and kind of the front runner on this is the French sociologist and philosopher Henri Lefebvre. He really developed this concept of the right to the city in the 1960s and 70s. And he defined it as a combination of the right to access resources and the right to be involved in urban policy. So the idea that citizens shape city spaces, and that the city as such is a dynamic space. He called it an œuvre, which is the French word for a work of art. So it's a dynamic space, a constantly changing space in which people and citizens of the city, citizens as in inhabitants of the city, not as in terms of citizenship or anything like that. So inhabitants of the city are at the front and center, shaping this space. So today, the right to the city movement defines the right to the city as the right of all inhabitants, present and future, permanent and temporary, to use, occupy, and produce just, inclusive, and sustainable cities defined as a common good essential to a full and decent life. Now, the right to the city movement also included this idea of rights in the city. So the key principles based on human rights. So like principles like equity, sustainability, inclusion, and access. And so the question obviously was, well, what does this really mean? And the sort of two rights kind of stick out. One is the right to participation, like, again, a democratic urban decision making, but then also the right to appropriation, which includes both the current use of space, physical access and occupation of the city, as well as the creation of new urban spaces, both physical, virtual, social, political, economical, and so on. What we see today is that we have multiple international documents that reference the International Human Rights Catalog. The New Urban Agenda talks about human rights in the city and the right to the city. And we really see a broad spectrum represented. I can give you some examples here. The European Charter for the Safeguarding of Human Rights in the City, for example. There's also the World Charter on the Right to the City and the Global Charter Agenda for Human Rights in the City. There's also a number of local level charters, like, for example, Montreal has one, Mexico City, and so on. And it does include, obviously, civil and political rights. It also includes economic, social, and cultural rights. These are often seen, as you know, these are often seen as aspirational in the international space, but are really key to addressing some of the most pressing urban problems, like poverty, for example. So there's a lot of focus on economic, social, and cultural rights. There's also rights of special groups like women's rights, children's rights, rights of people with disability, and so on, and some quote unquote, third generation rights. Some of these, there's some new ones that we see developing. The right to mobility, which I will actually use later as a case study. Right to land ownership, culture, security, quality of life, and so on. So it's really kind of broad. And these are not necessarily legalistic in nature. A lot of these are constructed more as a common language or to inspire activism that causes people to unite in the city behind common interests. So it's focused on the political struggle and social relations. So they're actively made in some ways from the bottom up. So it's more grassroots, right? From campaigns, activism movements, negotiations, and so on. And so this has really led to clarification, again, to some newer rights, like the right to mobility or the right to sustainable and healthy development, the right to health, the right to social justice, and so on. So this is pretty interesting from a human rights perspective. Obviously, the question is, well, what does this all mean in the context of this increased digitalization and so on? And I want to briefly talk about smart cities. Usually when we talk about smart cities, what we mean are cities that use information and communication technologies, the Internet of Things, cloud computing, and other technological applications. And the data they produce is vehicles to transform the city to the benefit and its inhabitants. So if you think about smart cities, they have revolutionized city government and administration through e-governance. For example, digital city operating systems like urban dashboards, smart meters, online transactions, online building management, or sensor-driven device delivery like smart grids or dynamic waste collection routing. There's also automated interventions in the environment, like sensor networks that measure pollutions, noise, flood management with programmed responses, and to increases in water flow, and so on. So they really have created new avenues for people to participate in decision-making processes, again, through e-governance, like e-voting, for example, to get around. If you think about intelligence transport system and mobility apps, smart travel cards, bike shares. I don't know if you have that too, those little rollers. They're all around Birmingham, at least. Smart parking, so you don't have to use the coins anymore. You know where the parking spaces are open, rideshare services, and so on. So it really has impacted how people live. It really impacts a large part of our life. And so the question is, well, how has this affected people, and how has it affected human rights? And there's a couple of critiques, social critiques, that have been developed in the literature. And this was part of my work that I was doing while I was a fellow at the Carr Center. So again, thank you to the Carr Center for supporting this work. And the first one is kind of the most obvious one. Like, if you look at smart cities, like, you often get these kinds of pictures that you see here, and people are missing. There's a lot of focus on, well, how do we automate traffic signals to optimize, vehicle traffic, without the thought that there will be pedestrians, there might be cyclists, there might be, all kinds of different other parts. So the biggest issue here is that, there's really like no focus on people. And again, I talked about this, like, cities are essentially habitats for humans. So leaving humans out of this equation is a big problem. And I would say the smart city industry has kind of realized that. And so now they're using language like, oh, we're citizen friendly and so on. But a lot of it is lip service. And a lot of it is kind of tokenism. It's not really the focus of things. So smart city, one of the biggest critiques that I have of smart cities from a human rights perspective, it really doesn't focus directly on the people. A related problem is sort of this overemphasis on what can be solved through technology. Green, in his book on smart urbanism, actually calls this tech goggles, right? So the idea that technology is neutral, objective, and politically benign, that engineers, they usually don't think about their biases, but perceive their work as value neutral. So instead of actually looking at what the real problem was or is in a city, it's really all of a sudden everything can be solved, quote unquote, by technology band-aids, so they call. So there's an overemphasis of what technology can do, and this pushes the actual problem, whether it be poverty, migration, climate change, whatever it is, into the background. Further, smart cities are usually implemented top-down and lead to technocratic government. So it's corporate government bureaucracies that drive smart cities. Citizens in the smart city are just seen as data points or consumers, testers, investors, instead of creators and leaders of city policy. There are some examples of citizen-led initiatives, but they're very location-specific and not necessarily representing the majority. So in some ways, it's really interesting because the smart city kind of creates a paradox, right? It creates new avenues for people to participate, but the participation is less meaningful because it's within like a particular software avenue, for example, that streamlines the direction. It can't be as creative and as inclusive. Obviously, corporatization and privatization are a big problem. Again, often it's big companies like Google, Siemens, IBM, General Electric, and so on that are behind this. Often the public sector is seen as inept. And so these big tech companies try to work around governments and kind of come up with their own way. Like a good example is Quayside in Toronto. You might have heard of it. Quayside is an area at the Toronto waterfront that was given to Waterfront Toronto to develop, which is a organization tasked with that. And they partnered with Google/Alphabet's Sidewalk Labs to create a tiny smart city. The project ultimately fell through for a variety of reasons, but one big one was the question of human rights and privacy implication of this. And sort of the agreement between Waterfront Toronto and Sidewalk Labs was basically confidential. It was a secret, and so there were all kinds of different difficult problems, kind of showing what this corporatization and privatization leads to and what kind of implications it has on people's lives. Obviously, it has the opportunity not only to provide access, but also to reinforce divides and inequities. We've seen this, I would say, very clearly in the pandemic when everything shifted online and older people with disabilities, people in poverty who do not have access to smart devices, they're left behind. It also, a lot of these solutions are designed, or these technological solutions are designed for the quote unquote general citizen, meaning, white, male, straight, middle-aged, able-bodied, cisgender, middle-class person. And those who do not identify like that are left behind. So it's obviously a problem. Surveillance and privacy violations. I know you've had talks on this, so I'm not going to go in this very deeply. But this data determinism, for example, based on what someone might do, and racially biased algorithms, and so on. Those kinds of issues. The question of consent, of being filmed and so on. Those are obvious problems. And then certainly security concerns, like on the city level, like hacking of city systems, data breaches, power outages, false emergency alert. You probably remember the one in Hawaii in 2018 about nuclear issue. Or on personal level, right? It's the garage door, the routers, the baby monitors, and so on. So the question for me was, okay, if we think about this, like if we take these social critiques and human rights critiques into account, how do we actually implement the smart human rights city? And I came up with sort of 4 principles. First, is sort of what I mentioned, right? Like prioritize addressing the complex social, political, and economic issues, and kind of resisted the temptation of the tech goggles. Green actually in his book proposes a tech test for urban policy. So if an outcome is possible without technology, would the policy still be innovative and the outcomes desirable? If yes, then technology should be adopted. If not, then it shouldn't be. So really the focus, what is the actual problem, instead of just using the tech Band-Aid. Creating a multi-stakeholder engagement process is sort of the second one, with citizens as drivers. Often people who developed smart city solutions do not live in those cities, are focused on different issues that have different agendas, right? Corporate, like capitalism, right? Like money. It's not about, so including citizens who know about the local situation is really important. And then obviously human rights education, like what are people's rights in cities? How can they claim them? What are some of the issues that technology might create for them, and how do we address those potential human rights violations? So a human rights-based approach can be used, or I suggest a human rights-based approach be used to evaluate smart cities policy. So the human rights-based approach originally developed in relation to the in relation to international development or health, and it sort of has these principles, again, non-discrimination, equality. I think that's pretty straightforward. Empowerment, so again, human rights as a tool to empower people to claim what they're entitled to. Focus on agency by underrepresented groups. Accountability and transparency. Again, this is exactly something we do not see in smart city policy. Participation and inclusion, again, going back to the multi-stakeholder process. Access to resources and information. And then sort of this idea of indivisibility and interdependent on human rights. So the focus not just on civil and political rights, as we often see it, at least in the US, right, at the state level, but really the focusing of inclusion of economic, social, and cultural rights as well. And so what we've done, and then I want to kind of, and I'm just going to go briefly, we've developed a couple of projects, like empirical projects, where we're testing this. A lot of my work, this framework, like we're using this framework to actually implement some of these smart city technologies. A lot of my work traditionally has focused on people with disabilities. So a lot of these projects focus on people with disabilities. And so I want to give you a quick example. I'm not going to go too deep. I'm happy to answer questions, though, if you have questions about how we thought about methods and inclusion and those kinds of things. But I want to give you a quick example of how we use this this framework, how we use this framework to actually create projects that follow these 4 principles. So my example is the right to urban mobility for people with disabilities. Just to give you a little bit of background, so here's how we framed the project. So the right to mobility, which I mentioned earlier, is one of the rights that's developing in the context of the right to the city and right in the city. So the right to be to public transportation, the right to be able to get around in the city, regardless of your status, gender, race, disability, and so on. Its origins come from the freedom of movement, Article 13 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And if you look at the social science literature, there's sort of 3 interpretations. Obviously, it's used very heavily in migration studies. I would say this is the most common form. Some of it focuses also on social mobility, so moving from one social hierarchy to the next. And then lastly, it has really been adopted by transport study, again, mostly as part of urban studies. This is, again, developing. So, this in discussions of how to diminish car travel and address traffic issues, public transportation, complete streets, walkability, which I come to, livability of cities, and so on. And it's part of this sort of new mobility paradigm. The idea, like looking at the movement of people, again, human migrate, individual mobility, travel, transport of ideas, like if we think about, memes traveling through the internet, and then also, the social implications of these movements, basically. So that's kind of the background to this. And so we're basically, what we're doing is merging critical urban theory with the human rights approach, and really look at the relation between the infrastructure and the built environment and the socio-spatial distribution of public goods, and then the political, economic, and social implication, transport cost exclusion and inclusion, accessibility and inequality. So like, who is part of it? Like, it's sort of under that term of mobility justice, which originally focused on physical accessibility and so on, but it really kind of is bigger than now. So it includes looking at the benefit or downsides of certain transport policies. So this is what we look at, and then finally, again, the influence of social status, norms, and power relations on mobility with regards to class, gender, race, ethnicity, and disability, just to give you sort of this background. And again, like, if we take that framework that I just mentioned earlier, like, here are some of the important, like, things that would need to happen, right? Citizen participation in the making of transport policy and implementation as well. Again, power relations are important, no tech goggles, a bottom-up approach to counterbalance this top-down implementation and technocratic governments, countering corporatization and privatization, and then sort of, again, moving away from designing for the general citizen, like really being aware of who is missing in the discussion. And when we look at people with disabilities, there's actually, in the World Charter for the right to the city, Article 13 has one paragraph that specifically focuses on people with disabilities, saying that cities should promote removal of architectural barriers, installation of necessary facilities in the mobility and circulation system, adaptation of public and public use buildings and work and leisure facilities to guarantee access for persons with disabilities. And some of this is, like what we see in the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, but some of it goes beyond that, right? It's really thinking, like, it's a mindset, right? How can you think inclusively? That's what we're trying to do here. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip this idea, the next couple of slides, but again, disability is very prevalent in our society. About 1 in 4 Americans have a disability. Obviously, it correlates with age. We have an aging society, so this is really important. And the way we see disability is not necessarily focused on, the impairment of a person, right? This would be the medical person, like he cannot vote because of his mobility impairment. What we embrace is the so-called social model of disability that looks at the barriers in the environment that keep someone from being fully included in a society. So in this case, it would be the stairs, right, that prevent him from reaching the ballot box. And also this kind of paternalistic approach that we've used with people with disability, kind of seeing them as less than, right? And so the stigma related to that. In cities, obviously, this is urgent. World population is aging, and also a large portion of people with disabilities live in cities. Cities can be places of great contradiction for people with disabilities, they can empower them. But if they're not inclusive, they can create real barriers. Here is from Wallet Hub. They do a rating of best cities to live in relating to the economy, quality of life, and healthcare. And you can see here Boston. Cambridge wasn't part of it. Boston is number 131. It did particularly bad in terms of the economy. It seems like there's a lot of problems for people with disabilities accessing jobs and so on. And you can see in the town that I live in, right, Birmingham, Alabama is number 170 of 182. So there's a lot of work to be done. And what we want to do is really increase access, built environment, virtual technological environment, and attitudinal environment. So really across the board, I'm happy to go back to this. I just want to make sure we have enough time to talk about, answer any questions. So the idea is, what we did is kind of assess mobility in Birmingham, Alabama. Again, this is the town we live in, and Birmingham has a complete streets ordinance. You can see at the bottom a complete streets, basically the idea that a street is not just for cars, but again accessible to everyone. It's for walking, it's for biking, it's for driving, it's for public transportation. It has some lighting, it is safe, it has curb cuts, it's accessible to everyone. And so we did an assessment of the walkability of 4 neighborhoods. We mainly looked at sidewalks and kind of looked at what some of the issues are. Here is I can show you, you can see here some of the issues. They're both permanent and temporary, like in this walkability assessment, like that tree, for example. Obviously, hopefully, that was eventually picked up, but some of these issues are permanent, like the lack of curb cuts, for example, and so on. Yeah, you get the idea. So that was part 1. We also in phase 2, we send out questionnaires to find out how residents rate their level of mobility and accessibility of their neighborhoods. We adapted the neighborhood environment walkability scale for disability-related purposes, and developed the questions in collaboration with a local disability rights organization. And, to no big surprise, we found that walkability is bad in Birmingham. Like, people cannot walk to a grocery store or a market or a school or a government building. Sidewalks are badly maintained. Different, depends on where exactly you look, but overall 57% dissatisfaction. Not wide enough for wheelchairs. Bus stops that are inaccessible, and 75% of people cannot access public transportation. And that, again, is even more difficult for people with disabilities. And so what we're doing is kind of try to use smart technology to make cities accessible. And we kind of have 2 areas of focus. One is we're using WheelMap. This is a map that was developed originally in Berlin. You see the top picture. This is actually Berlin. And, we started doing this in Birmingham. We had a mapping marathon and pandemic hit. And so we haven't been able to continue, but we hope to pick it back up. Basically what it does, it's crowdsourced. People can rate, I think 170 different things, quote unquote, or locations. So including restaurants, bathrooms, playgrounds, bus stops, and so on for accessibility. And it's sort of a very easy system. You see here red, orange, and green. So basically red means it's not accessible at all. Orange means it might have like an inch of a small 1 step or something, or a couple of inches step, which again, for someone with a mobility impairment might be doable. And then the green means it's 100% accessible, and especially bathrooms and bathroom access can be really important thing for people with disabilities to know. And then the second one is, you see at the bottom, is Project Sidewalk. We haven't started working with them, but we hope to start working with them. It's out of University of Maryland and University of Chicago. University of Illinois at Chicago. Kind of people using Google, using Google and kind of mapping where the curb cuts are. So really kind of combining, again, this human rights lens with technology that's already available. The other thing we started doing, working on, is a mobility assessment in the larger Birmingham area, where we use a community-based participatory framework to influence the smart city technology. So we've done focus groups. We're working on a survey to be used to create a simulation that then, machine learning that then can be used for an app development for people with disability to access transportation in the Birmingham area. So this is in collaboration with the city of Birmingham and with the School of Engineering at UAB. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you again to everyone, all these different centers and institutions that have contributed to this research, and I'll stop here and happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tina, for this very, very wide-ranging city tour, smart city tour, and tour of possibilities in cities. Let me start us off with one question. So you, with a question that came to me as I was listening to you. So you seem to be your overall take on smart cities seems to be pretty negative. So, basically there was these various images that you had. So where are the people, right? So this, which is not an unusual phenomenon, that people who are deploying technology get carried away by all the coolness and, the economic potential of technology, the engineering mindset. And they're forgetting about inclusivity and the people and how this can help, especially marginalized people. So it's unfortunately not an observation that so it's unfortunately an observation that commonly has to make. But then you had some other examples later, about how some good work can be done. For example, this disability map in Berlin and things, work that you yourself and some other people did in Birmingham. Are there good examples among the cities that one hears about when smart cities are discussed, like Singapore, Barcelona, Zurich, as I mentioned earlier? Are there good examples where you'd say there is a city that is like ranked highly in all these smart city rankings that we see every once in a while? So they're doing well on the smart city scoring, but they're actually also doing well comprehensively on the human rights front, rather than maybe here and there.
Yeah, I mean, there's, I don't want to give the impression that all of this technology is bad. It really has opportunities to open up new avenues for citizens to participate and for human rights to be implemented. It's just, it can't be an afterthought. So we do see some of that, like if we look at cities that are both smart cities and human rights cities, right, where they already have the kind of institutions to bring some of these concerns forward. I would say, for example, Geneva is a good example of both a smart city and a human rights city, where the approach has been very deliberate, right, to kind of integrate both. There's also, New York City has done some specific work on disability access, for example. So it's one of the reasons why it's rated higher on that. You remember the slide with the cities, for example, than Boston, even though some of the infrastructure in New York City is old compared to, let's say Birmingham, right? So there's definitely some examples. What we see is if cities kind of are intentional about inclusion, social justice, human rights kind of questions, and embrace basically the diversity of their citizens.
But there isn't really so I'm looking for, is there a place that I could visit if I wanted to see like smart city well done by human rights standards?
Geneva.
I wanted to do that kind of,
yeah,
Geneva is the place. Yeah.
I mean, it's one of the places. I would say, maybe like in the U.S. again. There's some interesting stuff that's been done in New York, which I know is maybe a little bit closer for you to access. So, I don't think there is, top of my head, I would say, go look here. It's really interesting to see, different types of initiatives in different cities, right? I mean, K-side Toronto was supposed to be that, like, particularly citizen friendly and so on, but it really ended up not being like the push from the corporations, even though they had all the right language, like, you look at the proposals, diversity and so on, is like there, right? But the question is it truly, citizen focused, or is it just lip service? So, and, it can be difficult to do, it's obviously, well, all of us who work with humans, right? We know this is a messy business. And usually corporations, they want to do things quickly, right? That's often why they do go around or do not like to work with city governments that have processes in place that might take longer, and especially if you have democratic processes. So it's not a match made in heaven, let me put it that way.
Thank you, Tina, for this fascinating presentation. And it's so nice to reconnect with your work that you were involved in while you were a fellow here at the Carr Center in the inaugural Tech and Human Rights Fellows Program. So I have several questions, but the first is, you outlined this sort of four-pronged approach or set of principles. And I'm wondering whether these would equally apply to cities that are not smart cities, such as prioritizing social, political, economic issues over technocratic approaches, multi-stakeholder engagement, acknowledging diversity, and building in human rights values and principles and approaches into planning efforts. So how is it different in the context of smart cities? Is it just that technology is accelerating certain processes and also making decision-making more opaque? Or how does the smart city approach differ from how all cities should be approaching citizen engagement?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. And I do think that the sort of 4-point framework should apply to all cities. What we do see, again, is this kind of tech goggle phenomenon that kind of makes it more difficult to see, or the prior, some of the human rights priorities that I've outlined just get pushed even farther back into they're not as much of a priority. And so I would say the difference between just the city and the smart city is that because all of a sudden the focus is so much on the technology, and again, often, like, if you look at the smart cities literature, it focuses very much on autonomous vehicles, on traffic lights, on those kinds of things that are not citizen or human specific, and so it makes that connection even more important to stress those 4 principles. But this being said, obviously ideally they would apply to all cities. Right, but it's just more in my mind, more important to stress them in the technology context because they might be more hidden.
So you outlined some really interesting work around rights to the city and rights in the city. And I'm wondering whether mobilization around smart cities and human rights could actually serve as a vehicle to counter the trends that are occurring nationally around attacks on human rights and closing civic space, where in many cases, national leaders are questioning the value and legitimacy of human rights, but perhaps these movements at local efforts could help revitalize commitments to human rights.
I very much agree. Like, we see this happening. I mean, I can give you good examples from where I live, right? That Birmingham, it's the largest city in Alabama, run by a Democratic mayor in a deeply red state. So, there's a lot of human rights initiatives in the city of Birmingham, but if you look at the state, pretty much all civil rights decisions have to be implemented through the judge, through judges, right, through the legal system. So, if you look at historically integration of schools to, implementation of same-sex marriage and so on, redistricting of school districts, integration, and those kinds of things. So what we see is, for example, Birmingham being a leader, like they have again, and this might be normal for you, but like in Alabama, we have a human rights commission of the city. We have a social justice committee. We have, Birmingham became a sanctuary city for undocumented migrants and those kinds of things. It increased they tried. The state came down with a law that, didn't allow it, but they increased the minimum wage and those kinds of things. So we do see this on the local level, like here in Alabama, but we see it worldwide as well. Like, the idea really is that basically cities are stepping in where states can't, and they're becoming more important actors in this, state-centric international order. Like, we see this not just with regards to human rights, but obviously also with regards to the economy and so on. And the UN is actually, starting to recognize this, like mayors' conferences, international mayors' conferences, and so on, have gained influence. And so, the being able to have this conversation in cities can really be a driver of human rights activity. And so I think what you say is absolutely correct. And I do see this when studying cities and in my work. And so using technology, right, as an avenue to promote human rights is particularly important.
Yeah. No, I think all of this is incredibly timely, and there's other ways in which this has been recognized. So the Kennedy School has launched a new center actually on cities, and Bloomberg Center on cities, I think, and this is basically also. And we are trying, as Carr Center, we are trying to get more connected to that. We're really just following up on this set of thoughts. Right? It's in cities where people live. It's mayors who have a rather immediate impact on particular aspects, of life, thereby, including especially transportation, right? How people get around, and so yeah, I think this is really a message that just bears repeating, right? That is worth repeating, that how important cities are as locations for human rights, and especially how important then it also is to fold that into other smart city thinking. I have one question for you about the theoretical foundations of all this, and the big figure in the background you mentioned, Henri Lefebvre. So the right to the city has obtained this almost mantra-like status, right? It was just an incredibly cool formulation that he came up with, right? The right to the city. And it's been interpreted, I mean, it's partly it caught on so much because everybody interpreted the way they saw fit, right? And of course, you can easily see how, when some people are claiming we have the right to the city, that that may or may not include other people who are also claiming it, right? So, and it seems like you are interpreting that in terms of the human rights framework, which obviously I like very much. Does Lefebvre still play any role in the serious debates here, or is this really more like the mantra that we're getting from the old man?
I would say it's mostly the impetus, like sort of the person who kind of coined these terms and started the theoretical discussion. Like what I've looked at mostly is, right, how do we take this idea of the right to the city and actually make it a reality, sort of looking how these charters that I mentioned, like the global charter agenda for the right to the city and the World Charter on Human Rights in the City and so on, actually take this framework and take concrete international human rights and try to give them effect at the local level. And to me, what's really interesting, like sort of this idea, again, like Lefebvre was mainly focused on this dynamic space and how it changes over time, and how we, participation and appropriation can adapt or can change a city to make it more human friendly, right? Like what this actually means, using a universal declaration of human rights framework. He doesn't really use that particular framework, but that's sort of like where I think cities have taken it, right? Like the actual pragmatic, more down to earth approach. So he does still play a role, like as the forethinker, I guess, so the founding father in some ways of all this. And some of the discussions, obviously, especially in sociology, center around his theories, but like where I took it, again, more from an international human rights perspective, like how do we take these international documents and make them count at the local level?
So Tina, I'm wondering, as we are having this discussion, whether there are implications for equitable access for everyone, given that communities and cities are divided, whether it's by race or citizenship or language or disability, as you said. So as you think about these processes for community engagement and so on, are there dangers that more powerful groups and interests could be privileged in these processes when shaping smart cities?
No, yes, I would say absolutely. Like, when we look at disability, for example, specifically, the strong groups are people with mobility impairments, the blind and the deaf. And people with intellectual disabilities, people with developmental disabilities, they're usually within the group of people with disabilities left behind. And you see the same kind of thing, right? Like obviously intersectionalities need to be taken into account, like, race, gender, disability status. If, like all of these are compounded, it makes it more difficult to include. And usually there's sort of inner group almost, differences that need to be taken account. And the question, again, who is not at the table and why, needs to be asked very deliberately in these situations. You're right, like, even if we say, oh, let's make sure we have, racial considerations represented, that doesn't necessarily mean that the experience is the same for everyone. And this makes it why this discussion can be really difficult and, again, messy. Like one of the reasons why tech companies do not like to engage is because it prolongs the process, right? Like how long do you go until you make sure everyone has had a voice and had their input on a particular policy or a particular change? So but nevertheless, I would argue that from a human rights perspective, you want to be as inclusive as possible and make access as equitable as possible.
Tina, thank you so much for joining us today and for your fascinating presentation and conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. It was such a pleasure to be here and to be able to share where I've taken the work that I did at the Carr Center. So thank you so much.